everybody, and welcome to Limited Level Up's, the live recording on Twitch, and hello, Limited Level Up's podcast feed, and YouTube, of course. This is the Innistrad Midnight Hunt set overview. So this isn't quite a set review like the one I did with Ethan on stream a few days ago. This is more a condensed set review. I did this for AFR, and people really liked it, so we're back again. And basically what this is a big picture look at the set, not going through every single common and uncommon and rare, more just pointing out key cards, pointing out archetypes, talking about them, going a bit more in depth than we did on the set review, talking about top commons, and talking about some question mark cards that are interesting to keep note of as we move into the format, seeing how the evaluations of things change, and just some cards I'm curious about, basically. So this is a good replacement, but it's also a good supplementary piece of content, I think, if you've already listened to the set review with me and Ethan. It's also good if you don't want to sit through 5 hours of us talking about every single common, you just wanted to get to the meat, the real, the juicy stuff of the set. So hope you enjoy the ride, and yeah, we'll just get started. As always, it's going to be, I'm going to be going through my slideshow here for those who are listening on audio. I do have a slideshow. And, oh, by the way, if you are listening on audio, I put these up on YouTube and on Twitch feed. So if you want to watch the visual component and you're listening through audio, please feel free to go on the YouTube, Limited Level Up's YouTube, just search it, or my Twitch feed, Cordo Calls on Twitch. As always, we're gonna have a Q&A chat section at the end. So chat, if there's anything that you want to go into depth a little further, if there's anything that I missed, if there's anything you want clarification on, please feel free to get those questions lined up, locked and loaded. Right before we jump in, of course, got to shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That is the place you can go if you like my stuff. If you want to support what I'm doing here, if you want to see more of it, if you want to see both a set review and a set overview every set, this really, really does help. Really appreciate everybody each week who contributes, keeps the lights on, and of course, we want to give back to you as well. There's a bunch of reward tiers over there on our Patreon page for a bunch of different tiers. There's coaching, there's draft log reviews, there's deck help, there's a bunch of Discord rewards over there. The Discord, Limited Level Up's Discord, is free for anybody to join. That's command Discord in the Twitch chat if you want to join that, or bit.ly if you're just listening, / join the Discord, cord spelled with a CH, like Corda Calls. Great place to get better Limited. Really great people over there. All right, and with that, let's just move on into our set overview. So I want to start by talking about the mechanics. And I think for any set, when I'm evaluating a new set, I look at the mechanics, I evaluate, I really try to do a deep dive, think about mechanically, no pun intended, what the mechanics are asking of you, right? What the deck building incentives are, what the drafting incentives are. Really try to do like a kind of a structural breakdown. I'm going to do a little bit of that here today. But I would say, if you're somebody who's like trying to really get a jump ahead of the competition, week 1, week 2, really look at the mechanics, really look at the architecture of the set, is the way I would put it, right? Put on your designer's hat, kind of go, what are they thinking here? Why do they want these mechanics in? What cards play well with them? And I think that really helps to frame every single card in the set. Right, there's a bunch of cards that you kind of stumble upon sometimes, and you're like, oh, this is a weird looking card. What's this doing here? And then you realize, oh, of course, it's because, it plays well with Decayed, or it plays well with Flashback. And I gotta tell you, a lot of people that are just jumping on Arena, they don't do this overview, right? They're just jumping into the set blind, which is fine, totally fine. But you're gonna have a big advantage over people if you do this kind of mechanical overview. Give yourself the correct lens to view the set through, basically. Is the way I would put it. So the first one that I want to start with here is Night and Day. This is a big one. This is kind of the headliner of the set, and it's not the most intuitive mechanic. I gotta say, it's a really cool mechanic from a flavor perspective, but it's the mechanic that I have seen people get be a bit fuzzy on, be foggy on, mess up the minutia of. Look, I mean, limited resources to their set review, and even they got it a little bit mixed up. So it's not the most intuitive mechanic, and I want to just try to spell it out a little bit here, just to make it clear. So, as the game begins, it's neither night nor day. That's important. There's no stay. It's just a normal game of Magic, right? When a permanent with Daybound enters the battlefield, which is most likely a werewolf, it becomes day. So the cycle gets put into effect essentially, right? And what happens is when a permanent with Daybound enters, it becomes day, and the cycle is introduced to the game, and it can never go back to neither day nor night. For the rest of the game, it'll always be either day or night, flipping back and forth. I want to also mention that it's not just permanents with Daybound, which are those werewolves that enter that introduce it. There's also cards like Gavany Dawnguard that, I'm not going to read the whole card, but it's just a creature that says if it's neither night or day, it becomes day as Gavany Dawnguard enters the battlefield. So what happens with night and day is if it's day and the player passes the turn, it's almost always going to start as day, and the player passes the turn, they didn't cast any spells on their turn, it'll become night as the other player starts their turn. And the opposite is true. So if it's night and the player casts 2 spells or more during their turn, as they pass the turn on the opponent's turn, it'll become day. Sorry, there's a little typo here, but I should say it'll become day as their turn starts. And the interesting thing about this compared to the last time we saw werewolves is that Daybound spells always enter as Daybound, but Nightbound spells always enter as Nightbound. Or sorry, I should say permanents, Nightbound permanents. So what that means is this is a bit of a power boost, right? Where your Nightbound spells, if it's night, they actually come in as better than their mana cost. You get a better creature than you normally would for that mana cost. So that's pretty cool. With the old werewolves and old Innistrad, you'd have to always cast them on the front side and then wait for them to flip. And this is just a little bit of an advantage, right? So when it's day, the creatures, like I just said, it'll enter on their day side. When it's night, it'll enter on the night side. Some small things I want to point out here that are little intricacies that I actually got wrong, when we did the set review. There is no window to respond to a transformation when you pass the turn. So in the set review with Ethan, I noted that Tolvar, who has an activated ability on his backside to pump something, I was like, oh, it's kind of cool. You can even if it's going to turn back today, you can go upkeep, activate my Tolvar, pump, and then it flips. No, that doesn't happen. That would happen if it was an old Innistrad werewolf. The flip happens right at I believe the phrasing is either during upkeep or before upkeep. But it doesn't really matter. The long and short of it is there is no window. As the turn passes, they literally just become. They just become the creature, right? Before untap. That's actually the phrase. Yeah, thank you, Ottawa, in chat there. And so what that means is you can't activate abilities on one side if the other side doesn't have the ability. But it also matters for a card like Moonrager Slash, where it's 2 in a red for an instant, and says this spell costs 2 less to cast if it's night, and it deals 3 damage, right? And so what that means is, with the old werewolves, and a lot of this, I'm speaking to, if you've never played with Night and Day, maybe this isn't all of that unintuitive to you, but if you have played with the old werewolves, this might be a little bit different. In the old werewolf, the way the old werewolves work, you go pass the turn, trigger on the stack of them flipping, I bolt your thing that was going to turn to a 4 toughness creature. You can't do that. If you want to Moonrager Slash something that has 3 toughness that will turn to 4 toughness, you need to do it on your turn. Because if you pass the turn, there is no window, right? It's just going to become that bigger creature, and you won't be able to bolt the thing. So just some things to think about. So let's talk about some mechanical deck building / drafting things to think about when you're talking about day and night and werewolves. Instants obviously play well with the werewolves. When you are the werewolf deck, or you have a lot of daybound, nightbound cards in your deck, you want to try to keep it Nightbound as often as possible, right? Because that's when your cards are you want to keep it night as often as possible. That's when your cards are going to be at their best, and that means that you want to pass the turn without casting spells. Well, you don't want to light a bunch of mana on fire, as Ethan and Ben would say, and so because of that, you want to have instants in your deck, so you can cast instants on your opponent's turn. You pass the turn, you still have stuff to do with your mana. Of course, that means that flash creatures play well here, and there's a few flash creatures in the set, so you can pick those up. And of course, the other thing is activated abilities, right? Activated abilities, you can go, okay, I have 2 werewolves, I would like to flip them, I'm going to pass the turn, and I can still use my mana, because you have Hound Tamer here, which is a creature with a 4 mana ability that says, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So, that's kind of a cool thing. Something to consider as the player without daybound or nightbound spells. is that you're probably going to want to do your best to double spell on your turn so you can keep it day, right? There's always going to be this fight, this tension where it's like the player with the werewolves wants to keep it night and the player without the werewolves wants to keep it day. And so as the player that wants to keep it day, you're incentivized to double spell, right? That either means you're going to want to put cards in your deck like Consider, which is a single blue mana, look at the top card of your library, you put that card in your graveyard, draw a card. Blade Brand is another one where it's like 1 in a black, target creature gains death touch until on a turn, draw a card. And these help you double spell because, you'll cast a cheap spell and then you can either draw into another spell or maybe you just have another spell in hand and you can flip it back. So that's something to think about. This also means that during game, you want to sequence your spells. You might want to consider, hey, maybe it's worth not playing this 2-drop here that doesn't impact the board that much and save it for next turn so I can flip my opponent's werewolves back. So you just want to consider that when you're playing. Something that I think I didn't quite grasp during the set review, but the more I've been thinking about it, and maybe this is a little bit awkward, but I wonder how much you really want to consider this when you're building your deck and drafting, is that cards with flash or instants, especially counter spells, when you don't have incentive to keep things nightbound, when you actually want to keep things day, they get a lot worse, right? So, Flip the Switch is a common counter spell. Devious Cover Up is another common counter spell. If you're the player who doesn't have the nightbound stuff and your opponents do, wow, do these counter spells get really, really bad because you're so incentivized to cast something on your turn. Even something like Nebelgast Intruder, which is a pretty good card, right? Nebelgast Intruder is 2 and a blue for a 2/1 flash flying. When it enters the battlefield, up to 1 target creature your opponent controls gets -2/-0 until end of turn. That's a great card. Your plan is often to ambush a small creature, but that plan just doesn't work if you you're going to be in a lot of trouble and your opponent's werewolves flip and you have 4 or 5 more power on the board. So I don't know exactly how much this is going to impact the way we draft and the way we play. Maybe I'm over-indexing a little bit for there's not going to be actually that many werewolves in a given game. But it's definitely something to think about. And if you're, this kind of blue, you plan to be this blue controlling deck with a bunch of instants, that might not work. That might not work in a very stark way that we haven't seen before, where it's wow, this truly, truly gets punished. I mean, I guess I shouldn't say we haven't seen it before. We've seen it, in other Innistrad sets, but there's more blue instant stuff, I think, in this set than we had seen in those previous sets. Okay, let's move on to Flashback. That's the end of day-night stuff going on here. Flashback is a pretty simple mechanic. I'm sure if you've consumed any Innistrad content, you've heard anything about this set, you know what Flashback is, but I'll explain it really quick. You've got Join the Dance here, for example, green and a white for a sorcery, create 2 1/1 white human tokens, and it has Flashback for 3 white green. Basically just means you can cast it from your graveyard, right? And so the general deck building and drafting implications for Flashback are that things that discard as a cost, you can obviously mitigate that cost by discarding a Flashback card. Looting is good because you can loot away the Flashback spells, draw a card. It's almost like drawing a card. It's like you drew a card in half a little bit. Things that self-mill, those obviously go up in value a little bit because you can eventually, at some point in the game, you might self-mill a spell. So just some things to consider when you're drafting deck building. I wouldn't say this should affect your draft too much. Like, a lot of the time, the way the set's constructed is they just... The cards will naturally self-mill or discard as a cost. Like, there's just a lot of cards in the set that do that. So it's not like an A plus B synergy where it's like, oh, I've got Flashback, I really need to pick up these things. A lot of the times they just happen. I think it's going to be pretty incidental. Another little quirk about Flashback is there's a lot of there's a lot of cards in the set that care about when you cast spells, right? So the blue-red archetype is Spells Matters. So you have something like Thermo Alchemist, 1 and a red for a 0/3 defender. It taps, it deals damage, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you untap Thermo Alchemist. Well, your Flashback card counts as 2 triggers for that, essentially, right? So another thing to think about, another little, it's a little boost to the blue-red archetype. If you just drafting a bunch of Flashback spells, helps all of your payoffs, essentially. Disturb. I promise I won't make another down with the sickness joke during this set overview like I did during the set review. That was well received by some and very poorly received by others. So we won't be venturing into that territory. But Disturb is really cool as we're just trailing off the flashback here. It's essentially flashback, but for creatures, right? Your Disturb creatures can be cast from your graveyard. When you cast them from your graveyard, they come back as something different. Usually a flyer of some sort. The interesting thing about Disturb, and we're going to get into this a little bit as we talk about the archetypes, is it plays out a little bit differently than Flashback does. Where Flashback kind of says, here's, cast your good rate spell on the front side, and on the back side, it's the same spell, but it's pretty expensive. You're paying a bit of a cost there. Disturb is a little bit different, where on the front side, the creature is usually not that good. It's usually like a small creature, an 0/4 blocker, a 2/1, and the backside is usually the side you actually want, in the most part. For the most part, a lot of times you're upgrading your creature when you disturb it. So the minigame might not be like Flashback, where it's like, let me see if I can get the most value out of this spell by casting it twice. I'm curious to see if the minigame becomes, let me see if I can bypass putting these creatures on the battlefield and instead getting them into my graveyard through discard or through self-mill, right? Because you actually want to cast the front side. So if you have ways to, loot away the front side, you actually want to cast the back side, not the front side. So if you have ways to loot away the front side, draw a real card, quote unquote, cast that real card, and you have the good disturb backside in the graveyard. That's a way to gain some incremental advantage, right? So kind of interesting. Like I said, we'll get into this a little bit more when we talk about blue-white. Coven. Coven is a mechanic that you're going to see on your green and white cards that says that it cares about you having 3 differently powered creatures. So you want to, prioritize differently powered creatures as you're drafting, and this is a mechanic that I actually, the more I think about it, you're not actually going to be, I don't think it's a macro synergy mechanic where you're like all in Coven, want to make sure I turn on my Coven cards. No, that's not going to be your main priority, right? You're mostly just going to be drafting a good green-white beatdown deck, and then just like I was talking about with the Flashback cards, where it's like the set is set up in such a way where you kind of just like, the cards just kind of do their thing, right? They kind of get milled incidentally, they get discarded incidentally. I think the green-white cards are built in such a way where you're not going to have to try that hard to make your deck, draft your deck in a way where it's like, I always have 3 differently powered creatures. A lot of the green and white commons just put counters on things. A lot of the green and white commons, there's like, they have sneaky ways to sneak in 1 power and 0 power creatures in there, right? So it's just going to be an incidental thing. I think you're more just going to be focused on, let me draft a good green and white beatdown deck. And one of the things that's interesting, one of the little wrinkles about Coven as an aggressive mechanic is that it kind of fights a little bit with what you want to do as an aggressive deck a lot of times. With an aggressive deck, you're thinking of attacking early, attacking often. You don't mind trading off your 2-drop so your 3-drop and your 4-drop can get in. This one wants you to sit back just a little bit, right? And this is in line with a lot of the payoffs, because I shouldn't say a lot. I think 2 of them at Uncommon ask you to go wide. And that lines up with sitting back, playing your creatures, and then doing something after, right? You want to like cast your 1/1s, your 2/2s, and then after you get all these differently powered creatures, you turn on your your uncommon, which is it's a 1 green white for a 3/3 vigilance, and then if you have Coven, your creatures get +1/+0 until end of turn. That is in line with just like chilling a little bit, not going all in, trading your creatures. So if Coven doesn't make that much sense if Coven doesn't make that much sense as an aggressive mechanic to you, that's kind of how the puzzle fits in a little bit more, where some of the better payoffs do ask you to go wide. As you're drafting Coven decks, I think 1-drops are going to be a priority because you want to get that train rolling early. So something like Snarling Wolf is actually really interesting. This is a single green mana for a 1/1 with a 2 mana ability, 1 and a green. The wolf gets +2/+2 until end of turn, activate only once per turn. Really cool in both ways, right? You have a 1-drop, again, to get that train rolling, but this is also a modular creature where you can have it be the 1-power creature if you need it to be, or the 3-power creature to fill in whatever you're missing in your Coven gap, right? Homestead Courage is another card that's kind of interesting, where it says, a single white mana for a sorcery, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains vigilance until end of turn. Flashback for a single white, so this lets you kind of like, mod up your creatures that might be, say you have 3 2/2s, well, you can go like make one of them a 3/3. I guess 3 2/2s doesn't really work, right? So you have like a 1/1, a 2/2, and a 3/3. You can put a counter on one of them, then you'll have Coven. If one of them dies, you can do it again to make your 2/2 into a 3/3. So that's kind of cool. You're gonna want cards that put counters on your creatures to mod them. And like I said, there's a lot of them scattered through the set. So to put a button on Coven, I think that it's going to be incidental for the most part. Like, it'll just work. Yeah, you don't have to work too hard to draft around it, but you do want to keep it in mind when you're drafting. Okay, now let's talk about Decayed. So Decayed is really strange. Decayed is the mechanic that's on 2/2 zombies that says this zombie or this creature, when it attacks, you sacrifice it, and it can't block. We're going to get into this just like with Blue White. Like I said, we'll get into it as we talk about the archetype. But I think this is the mechanic / the archetype that I am most curious to see how it plays out, because I could see it going a lot of different ways, right? The way you want to think about these cards that create these decayed zombies is more akin to, I would say, a resource more than just, you're not just, unlike like a green-white token deck where it's just like, I'm accruing all these creatures to go wide and attack eventually. That might be the way it plays out, but I think more so it's about accruing all these zombies to use as a resource, either to cards that specifically care about zombies, or to cards that you that want sacrifice fodder, or there's like a subset of cards that make you tap creatures to activate an ability. So it's like tacked onto a bunch of cards in the set where you'll incidentally get a zombie, right? So for example, Falcon Abomination is 2 and a blue for a 2/2, has flying, and it says when it enters the battlefield, you get a 2/2 zombie with decay. 2/2 flyer that made a 2/2 would just be an absurd card on its own, right? So, and obviously it's not that. It's the zombie is much worse than a regular 2/2 zombie. I think it's much worse than a regular 1/1, in fact, right? And so when you have these cards that make decayed tokens in your deck, you really, really want to think about what am I using them for, not so much like it's just a creature, right? And so there's a bunch of cards in the set. There's Corpse Cobble, blue and a black for an instant. This is one of the signposted uncommons. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice any number of creatures. Create an XX blue and black zombie creature token with menace, where X is the total power amongst the creatures you sacrificed. Flashback 3 blue black. So this is very explicit, like, put zombies in your deck, sacrifice them. You're going to make a big token because of it, right? And so all the incremental value you gain from casting, let's say, 3 cards that have decay on them, or 3 cards that make decay tokens, well, you can kind of funnel them into this Corpse Cobble, and you can make a large creature. Flesh Taker is kind of an interesting one here. So this is the black-white signpost in common, or I should say one of them, because there's 2 for each color pair. This is a 2/2 for black and a white. It says whenever you sacrifice another creature, you gain a life and you scry one, and it has an ability, single mana, sacrifice another creature. Flesh Taker gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So obviously you can sacrifice your zombies to this to make it bigger, but the cool thing is you can actually just attack with the zombie, and then the Flesh Taker will trigger. It'll give you the gain 1 life scry one. So that's a little kind of cool little synergy. And then there's just like other cards in the set that ask you to sacrifice things as a cost. We have Vivisection, where 3 and a blue sorcery, as an additional cost to cast it, you draw 3 cards. Ecstatic Awakener is a single mana for a 1/1. It has a 3 mana activated ability, sacrifice another creature, draw a card, and then transform Ecstatic Awakener, turns to a 4/4. So just be on the lookout for all of these, there's a lot of them scattered through the set, I should say, right? There's a lot of ways to use the decay tokens, not just things like Scob Wrangler, like we have here, which is 1 and a blue, 2/1, tap 3 untapped creatures you control, tap target creature. not just these, I've accrued a bunch of zombies and I can tap them for some ability. There's a lot of sacrifice things, or there's a lot of things that care about things dying. So for example, Diagraph Rebirth, this is 3 black-green for a sorcery, costs 1 last to cast for each creature that died this turn, return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield, has flashback 5 black-green. So like, if you want, you can kind of use your zombies as a lotus petal in a way, right? Like you can attack them in, even if they have a creature to block, they go, okay, block, something died though, and you'll get this for cheaper, maybe multiple mana cheaper if you have things that, if you have multiple zombies. So that's kind of interesting to think about. Okay, let's get into the actual archetypes. That was the breakdown of the mechanics, which I think are really helpful to take a look at as we're looking at these archetypes. Let's start with werewolves. So this is, of course, it's the werewolf set, and I think, we deserve to talk about them first. I think werewolves is a pretty straightforward deck. So I'm going to talk, for each of these archetypes, I'm going to talk about the signposts and commons a little bit, and just talk about my take on them, talk about, I think where I think their place in the format is. First up, we have Kessig Naturalist here. So this is red-green for a 2/2. It says when Kessig Naturalist attacks, add red or green mana to your mana pool. That mana doesn't empty as steps and phases end, and it has Daybound, of course. The backside is a 3/3 with that same mana ability, and it says other wolves and werewolves you control get +1/+1. Really good card, both in the I just attack you, kind of like Magda from Kaldheim, if you've played with that card, where it's like, okay, I attack you, even if you trade, I'm going to play a 4-drop here, which is really powerful. And just, if that keeps snowballing, that's great. But also, a 2-mana werewolf is really powerful, because your opponent's not always going to have a play on turn 2, and this will flip a good percentage of the time. When you just play it on turn 2, you pass the turn, opponent does nothing, it becomes a 3/3 Lord. One of the interesting things that I think is really smart from a design perspective that they did this time is they didn't actually include a lot of 2-mana werewolves, right? One of the problems is that with werewolves is that exact thing I just described, where it's like, my opponent played a 2-mana werewolf and I just didn't have a turn 2 play, now I'm probably just dead. There's this one, there's another uncommon one, but aside from that, you're not going to run into that all that often. The other signpost uncommon that we have here is an Unnatural Moonrise. This is red-green for a sorcery, it becomes night. Until end of turn, target creature gets +1/+0, gains trample, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. It's got flashback for 2 red-green. This is one of the toughest cards to evaluate, I think, out of the, in the whole set, actually, without actually playing it out and seeing how it works out. The more I think about this card, the more I like it. Obviously, you need werewolves in your deck. You need quite a few werewolves in your deck to, reliably get value of the It Becomes Night, right? Like I said before when I was talking about day and night, it's going to be a fight. It's going to be a battle for who can keep a day, who can keep a night, basically. And there is a reasonable cost to making it night, right? You're not always going to have an activated ability to use when you want to pass the turn to make it night. You're not always going to have an instant, like I said it was nice to do when you want to make it night. And so there's going to be tension where you're like, I'd really like to make it night, but I also want to cast some spells this turn, right? I think the fact that this just makes it night and can add, 4 or 5 power and toughness worth of stats to your board, I think that's pretty powerful. And of course, the cantripping nature of this card is pretty nice. It is conditional, of course, but I think the ceiling on this card is super, super high. You just have to be really careful of ensuring you have enough cards that really care about it being night to want to play this card. Also of note, if they remove the card, the creature you're targeting in response to this card, you do lose out on the It Becomes Night because the spell has a target. If the target is gone, the spell fizzles. So that's something to be careful of as you're playing with this card. Looking at the common werewolves just quickly here, I just want to talk about them. I think that they are decent, but none of them are like, oh man, this is the common werewolf you want. I think there's a few that, to be clear, there's only 4 of them actually, 2 in red and 2 in green. I think they're all pretty decent, but none of them stick out to me as yeah, this is the common, give me as many of the commons as you want here. The ones I like are Harvesttide Infiltrator. It's a 2 red 3/2 trample daybound. The backside is a 4/4. And the other one I like is the Tavern Ruffian. This is 4 mana, 3 in a red for a 2/5 daybound. It's a 6/5 on the back. I just like the stats on both sides of these, basically. I could see Tireless Hauler, the 4/5 green one. It says 5 mana, 4 and a green for a 4/5 Vigilance. Turns into a 6/6 Vigilance. I could see this being a card that, like, its stats line up really, really nicely with the format. Just 4/5 Vigilance into 6/6 Vigilance. Then that is a card you want. But of course, it's a 5-drop. You can't have too many of those. I can see a world where that actually becomes the more desirable one, right? But the point I want to make, basically, talking about these werewolves, is I think you do really want to look to the uncommons for your raw power, because a lot of the uncommons are really, really good. The uncommon werewolves, that is, right? You can look at the list yourself. I'm not going to go through all of them for the sake of time here, but there are some real nasty ones. We already talked about Kessig Naturalist, and I'd say the other ones are on par with the Naturalist on power. Maybe a little bit worse because they're more expensive, but they're some beaters. So the uncommon werewolves will be a high priority, I believe, in the draft in general, just because they're generically good cards. And of course, if you are drafting a deck that cares about it being night, or you're drafting that it makes it night card, they're going to be even higher priority. So just something to think about. I want to highlight one card here as I think a bit of a standout as far as how this deck's going to play out. It's like, just maybe I didn't touch on this, and maybe it's obvious, but red green is going to play out like an aggro deck, right? Like a beefy aggro deck where you just got these like overcosted, like a gruel stompy deck. You've got these undercosted beaters, and you're going to want to put all the type of cards that you would normally put in an aggro deck into your aggro deck. And the card that is a bit of a standout to me is Howl the Hunt. So this is 2 and a green for an enchantment. It's a flash aura. And it says, when Howl the Hunt enters the battlefield, if enchanted creature is a wolf or a werewolf, untap that creature. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has vigilance. So this card, we've seen this card before as just a +2/+2 flash enchantment. And the card was playable. It wasn't fantastic, but it was decent. You kind of felt it when you got gotten by it, right? And these kind of cards in general, like these combat tricks that double as an aura, like when your combat trick sticks around, that's a huge upgrade, basically, right? And so that's already something appealing about the card. Just that it's like combat trick that your green-red decks are going to want. Your green-red decks are going to want combat tricks. And then it's just like a step above the other combat tricks you might get because it sticks around. Add that to the fact that it has flash, which is obviously something desirable, and your opponent can't really play around this very well. So imagine you like have this in your hand on turn 4. Your opponent says, okay, like if you told your opponent, I have Howl the Hunt, you just showed it to them, what do they do? Right? Because like a lot of the times with the trick, it's like, okay, I'll get it out of their hand and it's fine. I'll suck it up. But like it sticks around, right? And the other thing you can do is just say, okay, no blocks, let me try to race them. But that's so hard with this card because you say no blocks, you go, okay, I still can't attack because if I attack, they untap their werewolf and it's huge, right? So I think this is a little, I'm just noting this as something that sticks out to me as more powerful than your average combat trick, basically. Okay, let's talk about vampires. So the vampire theme, of course, is, when I deal damage, something good happens. Not quite. It says, a lot of them say, I trigger an ability, or my trigger goes off when my opponent has been dealt damage, or when I enter the battlefield, I am better than I would have been if my opponent wasn't dealt damage. So the signposts in common here, or one of them is Vampire Socialite, red-black for a 2/2 menace. When it enters the battlefield, if an opponent lost life this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on each other vampire you control. As long as an opponent lost life this turn, each other vampire you control enters with a additional +1/+1 counter. Card is just really powerful. It's both an enabler and a payoff. It's a menace creature, meaning that you can get in more reliably, trigger your bloodthirst or spectacle, whatever you want to call it, card. So I'm really high on this card. And Hungry for More is the flashback cards. This is black-red for a sorcery. Create a 3/1 black and red vampire creature token with trample. It can, and lifelink and haste. You sacrifice it on your end step. It has flashback for 1 black-red, so 3 mana. This is just a really good tool for pushing damage. Like, sure, sometimes you'll go turn 5, cast this, deal you 3, and then turn on my vampire card that cared about dealing damage. But just in a vacuum, the 3/1 attacking you, trample, haste, lifelink, do it again next turn is just a good aggressive card, I would say, a lot of the time. And the lifelink here really does make the difference. We've seen this card in the past without lifelink as a creature, and I think the lifelink pushes it over the edge, just being like a solid card, right? So as far as the vampires go, it's actually kind of interesting. I feel like, so there's a lot of cards in the set, or a handful of cards in the set that are clearly pointed to, you want to, the purpose of this card is to enable your vampires early. So you've got Falcon Wrath Perforator, 1 and a red for a 2/1 vampire. When it attacks, it deals 1 to the defending player, right? Vampire Interloper, it's 1 and a black for a 2/1 flying. Vampire Interloper can't block. Voldaren Stinger, single red mana, 1/1. Has first strike as long as it's attacking. 3 mana pump ability, gets +2 until end of turn. So like, these cards on their own are actually not fantastic. They're a bit underrated, I would say. Like, Stinger, we saw Ferocious Pup in Kaldheim. Stinger is sort of like it. Vampire Interloper is a card I'm lower on than a lot of people, I think. I think that the can't block is a pretty big downside, even in your aggro deck. Like, you don't want to be blocking your aggro deck, but like in your aggro deck, the way your aggro decks play out a lot of the time is like, I get in early damage with my cheap creatures, and then eventually those cheap creatures, they like will chump block a 6/6 for a turn, so that I can like set up a lethal attack with a flyer, or set up a lethal attack with a burn spell next turn, or buy me time into drawing my effect that will end the game, right? And the fact that it is like never ever ever blocks, that's a real downside. So I just want to temper people's expectations a little bit on Vampire Interloper. It might pan out to be better than times we've seen it in the past, but the times I saw it in the past, it actually like wasn't amazing. Now, there was contextual factors, I will admit, but again, I just want to temper people's expectations. This isn't like a sick aggro card. It's a good one, but not just like jamming it in every black deck I have. And then Falcon Wrath Perforator, similar. This card, it enables your vampire cards, but it just dies pretty easily. You need a way to get it in repeatedly if you actually want to like keep it around as an enabler. So one of the questions I have basically is it worth putting these like not fantastic aggro cards? Because I want to be clear, these aggro cards I think are a bit below rate for what I would expect for a good aggressive 2-drop. Is it worth putting these cards in your deck for the synergies that you get paid off for, right? A lot of the vampire cards are very feast and famine-y, in the sense that like when you do their thing, they're pretty good, but when you don't do their thing, they're pretty darn bad, right? So for example, it's like we have Arrogant Outlaw. It's a 2 and a black for a 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, you drain them for 2. Great card if you can enable it. Pretty mediocre if you can't. And you see this pattern over and over for a lot of the vampire payoff cards. So it might just be, this is all speculation, right? But it might just be like, there might just be better things to be doing in the format, basically. You don't have to put like medium cards in your deck to enable medium synergies, is the way I would put it. Now, I don't have any foresight whether this is true or not. It's just something I want to bring up as a point for something to keep your eye on in the future. Here's the button to put on it, right? Vampire Perforator, Interloper, Voldaren Stinger, they are pretty good at doing the thing they do, as in they enable, they deal damage to your opponent pretty easily. My question is it going to be worth the hassle? That's all. That's really the the question I'm looking to answer as we go. The last thing I want to point out about vampires is the play patterns from the opposite side of the battlefield are to block. Like your opponent's going to be very heavily incentivized to block all of your creatures, so that they don't, you don't, say you just have that sea zombie on the battlefield. You don't have something like the 2/1 that pings when it attacks. You just have like a regular creature, and you go, I want to enable my vampire synergy. I want to turn on my vampire. I care about when damage was dealt to my opponent, right? I think on the opposite side of the battlefield, it's reasonable to assume that on the early turns of the game, that is something that your vampire opponent wants to do. And so because of that, because your opponent is going to be very incentivized to block, you can kind of use that to your advantage, right? So combat tricks get a little bit better, right? I mean, that's obvious in an aggressive deck, combat tricks get better. But you can kind of think of this as, if you remember Kaldheim, where there was decks you wanted to play Run Amok and there was decks you wanted to play Equipment. And the equipment decks were decks that naturally had evasion. You suit up your Battlefield Raptor and like your equipment do the thing where it's like, okay, I'm adding a lot of power to my evasive creatures. Whereas with the boast creatures, those played well with combat tricks, because the boast creatures, they didn't have evasion, but they really incentivized your opponent to block so that you wouldn't keep getting the boast trigger. And I think that's similar things here, where it's like your opponent is very incentivized to block so you don't trigger your vampire cards. So cards like Blade Brand, right? 1 in a black, instant target creature gains death touch until end of turn, draw a card. Stolen Vitality, 1 in a red, instant target creature gets +3/+1 until end of turn. If it's your turn, it gains trample, otherwise it gains first strike. This is going to be, I would assume, a class of cards you're going to be looking to play. Like, things that punish blocking, essentially, because it's going to be happening in the matchups with vampires a lot of the time. Another piece of the puzzle here is zombie, decay tokens here, where if you have a lot of black creatures or just black cards that make decay tokens, that's another way that you can get in damage by just saying, okay, my cards have just made decay tokens incidentally. I'm okay throwing away a decay token to get in 2 points here. Maybe you're even attacking with 2 decay tokens, one of them gets blocked, but I do get in for 2 points here. And so I turn on my vampire cards. So that's just something to consider. Might be another way to get in for that damage when the board is, a little bit disadvantageous for you, where you can't get in very clean attacks. Okay, zombies. So this is the one that I think is, like I said at the top of the show, is the most, I don't want to say confusing. Maybe confusing is the right word. But there's a lot going on here, and I am the most curious for exactly how these decks are going to play out and the incentives that you actually, want to devote your draft picks towards, or your gameplay decisions towards. So, talking about these decay tokens here for a second, just a little bit more. I think that the way that I have been framing it, as I did the set review with Ethan, and just as I have been thinking about these archetypes in the past few days, is your decay tokens are a resource of sort, right? It's like you're accruing some amount of value after you cast a Startle, right? Which is just a 2 mana instant, draw card, target creature gets -2 until end of turn, you make a decay token. Or the Falcon Abomination 2/2 flyer, where you make a 2/2 zombie as well, a 2/2 decayed zombie. Where like you just have all these cards in your deck that say decayed on them, or they make a decay token, and you accrue over the course of the game this zombie, this resource in the form of a token, and it like looks like a creature and it smells like a creature, but it doesn't taste like a creature. It doesn't attack very well, and it doesn't block at all. So it's more a resource than an actual creature, and so you can equate this to food, or you can equate this to energy. From other sets, where it's just like this incremental, you're slowly building it up, and you're using it on something, right? I think one of the interesting things, and here's I think the crux of what I want to talk about with zombies, is that so food I think is probably the most one-to-one comparison you can make when you're thinking about how it plays out in game, where in your Eldraine decks you had like all these food makers. And some of them had, you had some synergy payoffs where it was like you can use the food for an effect, but the food also had a baseline effect of I just gained 3 life. And that's a defensive ability, draws out the game. The zombie tokens, on the other hand, they do a similar thing. And to be fair, I think they have more applications than a food token did. But their baseline thing is I can deal damage to the opponent, right? Their baseline use of when I don't have an outlet isn't a defensive one, it's an offensive one. And so I've been thinking about these creatures that, you tap 3 untap creatures to do some sort of effect, Lurker Zombie, Siege Zombie, Scab Wrangler, and I don't know if these are actually going to be the thing you want to do, because these point to, I'm playing a long game, and I'm accruing a lot of zombies over the course of the game, or just making a board stall. And that doesn't quite jive with the the buyout of attacking with your zombie. It's kind of the opposite, right? It fights against it a little bit, where you want your buyout clause for your game piece, your zombie game piece, to be I deal them 2 damage, and that's something I inherently want, right? And so I don't actually think the zombie decks are going to play out defensively. I think they're better in the in a more aggressive shell, or a more tempo-oriented, or I guess I would say trending towards ending the game rather than trending towards prolonging them, right? Because as the game goes on, to go back to Nightbound, Daybound for a second, your Daybound opponents, your Nightbound, Daybound opponents, your Werewolf opponents, their cards start to get better, because as people stop casting spells, night happens more often. So I'm not sure as a defensive deck, I'm not sure there's good incentives to actually get to that late game, is the way I would put it, because I don't think there's a guarantee that you're actually going to be the one that's advantaged in the late game, right? So if you're not going to be advantaged in the late game, and to go back to the conversation we had about counterspells and day-night, if counterspells and like instant speed interaction isn't, gets a little bit of a knock in this format potentially, then you're probably going to want to use your resource for something proactive. And so what I think that means is going in week 1, and again, this is pretty speculative. This could change. Maybe we unlock something that we're like, oh, okay, I understand how zombies works now. But I think my baseline for going into week 1 is going to be, I am planning to use my zombies for something that directly affects the board, and something that points towards ending the game, not prolonging it, right? And so stuff like Ecstatic Awakener, which is the single black mana wizard that sacrifices a creature, draw a card, transform it to a 4/4. More Corrupt Behemoth, 4 and a blue, 7/6. 4 and a black, 7/6. You can either pay 2 additional mana or sacrifice a creature as a cost. It has menace. Falcon Abomination is another card. It's the 2/2 flyer that points towards ending the game. Like, as I went through the set, I was more impressed with the cards that pointed towards ending the game than prolonging them, because there's cards like Vivisection, which draws 3 cards. There's a few other like grindier cards like that, but I'm not that interested in those, to be honest. I'm more interested in these ones that like have an immediate impact on the board. And of course, like I said before, if all else fails, your zombies might eventually be like, let me attack you with a bunch, deal you 4 because I've attacked with 6 zombies, and 2 of them get through, or something like that. This also lines up, if we go back to our signposts and commons, which I, by the way, didn't go over these, but I'll go over them now. I talked about Corpse Cobble. This is the instant that sacrifices something to make a giant zombie. Sacrifices any number of creatures to make a giant zombie, and it has flashback. But Blade Stitch Scob is a blue-black 2/3, and it says other zombies you control get +1/+0. These actually point towards that same thing I was talking about, where being more pointing towards ending the game rather than prolonging it. Right? So if zombies is about prolonging the game, these cards actually get a little bit worse, I think, because giving your zombies +1/+0 really doesn't matter that much if you're playing to prolong the game. So just some food for thought. I've been using this phrase a lot, but to put a button on it, to put a bow on it, perhaps. I think that week 1, I'll be going in thinking zombies wants to generate a bunch of resources in the form of zombies, right? But be playing to the board, not be playing playing a game on the board, not playing a game in hand, basically. And not so much using the tap 3 untap creatures you control, accrue a marginal, value on the margin, right? Okay, let's talk about Disturbed. And so one of the things that I mentioned as we were talking about Disturbed and the mechanics is that I think that one of the questions I have going in is, will you actively try to bypass the battlefield and go straight to the graveyard? Again, to repeat what I was saying before, the front sides are generally not great. There's some exceptions, but the front side on the commons and some of the uncommons are like, meh, kind of, could take them or leave them, right? And so if you can set up a situation where you're discarding for value, as in you're drawing some cards, discarding some cards, or you're milling for value, and you're getting these good creatures in your yard, that could be how the game plays out, or how this archetype plays out. And if that is the case, a card like Faithful Mending, which is the flashback signpost uncommon, blue-white for an instant, gain 2, draw 2, then discard 2 cards, does go up in value quite a bit, and has flashback for 3 mana. This is a card, Faithful Mending, that me and Ethan rated, moderately high. I think we gave it a C+, which I know was a surprise to some people. I know Limited Resources gave this like a D. To be fair, I think they hadn't quite grasped what Blue-White was doing. When they gave it a D, it was like one of the earlier cards they saw, and they like kind of wrote it out off as a constructed card. And I want to kind of revisit our thoughts, or if this is the first time you're listening to this conversation, where Faithful Mending is not a... If you just throw this into any set, you wouldn't want to play this card. I don't think. Right? Where you wouldn't really want the Faithful Saluting effect of just like draw 2, discard 2, flashback. The first time you cast it, it's card disadvantage. The second time you cast it, it's card parity. Right? But the more we live in that world I was talking about, where you want to bypass the battlefield, the better this card gets. Of course. Now, will you be able to have enough flashback and disturb creatures in your deck where that becomes a reality, where you can reliably just have like 10 of these and you can reliably pitch 1 or 2 to them in your Faithful Mending, maybe 3 or 4 if you get to flash it back, perhaps. But I think another thing to think about is just flashback and disturb cards are just inherently high value, right? They're just very good cards and people are going to want them. So we probably, if I were to guess, I would say that disturb actually plays out just more like a value mechanic, kind of like we were saying before with Coven. I think it's just going to be more incidental, right? Where it's just like, you play the front side, great, you get a 2 for 1 because you trade it off, and you bring back the flying side. That's cool. I don't think there's actually going to be that much synergy with the deck. Now, incidental stuff, sure, Incidental Mill gets a little bit better, Incidental discard gets a little bit better, but not so much that I'm going to be drastically altering my pick order or anything like that. One of the things that is interesting is like just thinking about exactly what macro archetype Disturb falls into. Because Blue-White's kind of classically had this problem over the past few years where the white cards and the blue cards don't play well together. The white cards are very aggressive, the blue cards are very defensive. There's some aggressive blue cards and there's some defensive white cards, to be fair. But there's always some amount of tension, right? And so when I was trying to like put together some archetype skeletons for Blue-White, I was like, what am I actually building towards here? What is the classic archetype that this is, kind of referencing or going to be illuminating here? How is this deck going to play out? And I think if I were to guess, it's more aggressive than not. Or I should say it more is going to be about attacking rather than a control game. Right? Like, you can imagine a world where you're playing all these disturbed creatures, gumming up the ground early, and then, like, really dragging it out, getting infinite value off your graveyard. I don't think it's going to play out like that. I think it's more going to be almost like a Blue-White Flyers deck, right? Where the front side of your disturbed cards, they kind of just, like, act as the, the ground forces that help you not die. And then they most of them flip into Flyers, right? Which is kind of, actually, I think all of them flip into Flyers, which is kind of a natural synergy, where you have these early blockers that block, werewolves or whatever you have to block on the opposite side of the field, vampires, and then after the early stuff's traded off, you can bring back your Flyers and eventually win the game, right? That doesn't really point towards control necessarily. That more points towards, mid-range Blue-White Flyers, the classic archetype. Right? Maybe if you want to, frame it as tempo, potentially, I think that could be something that you could also frame it as well. So that's a big question I have. What archetype is this really fitting into? Like I said, I think my baseline is probably the classic Blue-White Flyers deck, and it really, this mechanic really nicely plays into that archetype, but we'll have to see, right? One of the cards I want to point out here that I think is going a little bit under the radar, and I think I wanted to like talk Ethan up a little bit on this one when we did our set review, but we kind of talked about it too long. We didn't have time. Is Shipwreck Sifters. So this is 1 and a blue for a 1/2 spirit. It's common, and it says when it enters the battlefield, draw a card, then discard a card. Okay, whenever you discard a spirit card or a card with disturb, put a +1/+1 counter on Shipwreck Sifters. So the dream scenario, of course, is you play this on turn 2, you pitch a disturb card, and you draw a new card, you get a counter on this thing. And like I was saying before, there might be a world where you actively want to bypass the battlefield with the front side of your disturb cards, and if that's true, then this card just goes up in value a lot, right? If you can get to the point where it's like, this is just like a 2/3 that essentially drew you a card, because one of, you pitch the disturb card and you draw a new card, that's a really powerful card. And so, the other point I want to make about this card is that it doesn't say when you pitch, when you discard a spirit or a disturb card to this ability. It just keeps accruing counters if you can keep doing it, right? So it can even get bigger. So, this is another one of those cards that I've kind of earmarked where, I can see this just like flopping, not actually being what you want to do, but I think that this is worth noting as I'm going to try to play a lot of these in week 1 and see how it works. Specifically, because these actually play pretty well together, right? You have one of these, multiple of these in your opening hand, you can just pitch one to the other, right? That's kind of cute. So, just wanted to point it out. I don't think it's like, oh man, this is going to make or break the archetype, but I think it is going a little bit under the radar, basically. One thing I want to note about Disturb is that Ryan Sachs, I was talking to Ryan a little bit, Ryan Sachs, over the weekend. We had a call, and one of the things he pointed out was that Disturb might play out, and I think this is likely, in the way that the blue-red Thopters deck did in Magic Origins. And for anybody who hasn't played that set, the blue-red archetype in Origins was all about like making Thopters and drafting these creatures that created Thopters when they enter the battlefield. The problem with that archetype, and there was like synergy cards that cared about Thopters and everything, so you really wanted to get as many as you could. The problem with that archetype was that the cards were too good for their own good. Basically, like, everybody wanted them. All the blue drafters, all the red drafters just wanted these cards. And so what happened was the synergy cards, the card that specifically played well with the Thopter cards, just ended up sucking because you could never get enough cards in your deck that you felt comfortable playing those synergy cards, right? And I think that might happen here, where Disturb is just an inherently powerful mechanic. People are just going to want the Disturb cards. They're all just good rate creatures. And so if we flash back, no pun intended, to Faithful Mending here, the instant you gain 2, draw 2, and then discard 2, this card does get a lot worse because you can't reach that threshold of I have enough Disturb cards and flashback cards to make this worth a card. You're just not going to want to play it. I think eventually, as the format goes on, people are going to draft the Disturb cards higher, and I think the deck might, as a result, just get a lot worse, right? Because you kind of end up with the scraps of like I was talking about before, the controlling blue cards and the kind of aggressive white cards. If you don't have that glue of the actual Disturb cards to be the come down early and block, flip into a flyer later, you don't have that incentive, you don't have really the key part of the deck. I don't know if blue-white is going to be a desirable color pair going, for very long in the format. You might have, like, really nutty busto decks, really high highs, but the low lows might be very low because you just don't want to put a lot of white cards and blue cards in the deck together. Alright, moving on to blue-red spells. So the signpost in common for blue-red, one of them is Storm Skrillex. This is 3 blue-red for a 2/3. It's a flyer, and your spells cost 1 less, instant sorceries cost 1 less, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, Storm Skrillex gets +2/+0 until end of turn. And the other one here we've got is Arcane Infusion, blue-red for an instant. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. You can reveal an instant or sorcery from among them, put the rest on the bottom in a random order. Flashback for 3 blue-red. So I've seen a lot of doubters of the blue-red deck in this format, and I think it's justified, actually. I kind of set that up for being like, you're all wrong. This deck's gonna be great. But I think if you're looking for this to be a deck that is well supported at common, you're probably looking at the wrong place. You're probably looking in the wrong place for that. Because I don't think this deck is very well supported at common. There's just not that many commons that make you want to play a bunch of spells. In the set review with Ethan, I kind of alluded to previous Innistrad sets where the incentive was very much to play a lot of spells. Like, I'm talking 15, 14 if you get your hands on them, because there was payoffs like Rise from the Tides and Burning Vengeance, which are just like these really sick payoffs if you had a ton of spells. I don't think that exists here at common. That's the key here. I do think that at rare and uncommon, this deck could be very, very, very good, because if you open up a Smoldering Egg, which is, a card with a lot of text, but basically is very good if you have spells in your deck, like really, really great card. Poppet Stitcher falls in the same category. These two are rares and mythics. Leer is another one that gives your spells flashback. Just like great cards. And then at uncommon we have like Seize the Storm, which is 4 in a red, 5 mana for a sorcery. It makes a giant elemental equal to the number of spells in your grave and flashback cards in exile, and it flashes back for 7 mana. Thermal Alchemist is the card I've talked about before. 1 in a red for an 0/3 for Defender. Tap, deal the damage when you cast it into a sorcery. Untap Thermal Alchemist. All of these cards are very, very good. So I imagine what's going to happen is in a lot of drafts, you'll first pick a Poppet Stitcher or a Smoldering Egg. And like that's just a good reason to draft a heavy spell deck. So while I don't think there's always going to be a blue-red spells deck at the table, and I certainly don't think you should go into it at common, like, if you picked up some blue commons and some good red commons, let's be blue-red. I do think that just like green-white in AFR, where, that one was less rare dependent, more uncommon dependent, but green-white at common was like, whatever. But when you got the good uncommons, it was a really good deck. And I think it's going to be very similar here. So while it won't come together often, I think the ceiling on the deck is really high, and I don't know. That's what I want to say about this deck, because I think a lot of players tend to write off decks if they don't exist at common. And, rightly so. I think that's definitely a knock. But if you write off the deck completely because there aren't good common payoffs, then you kind of, you cut yourself off from the times when you open up a Poppet Stitcher or you open up a Smoldering Egg, and you kind of like reluctant to take it because the deck doesn't exist at common, right? But that's a reason in itself to want to draft the deck, and especially if the deck doesn't exist in common and people start to realize that, you're gonna get the uncommon payoffs a little bit later than you would for any other good uncommons. Basically, I want to touch on our Arcane Infusion just quickly. This is that spell that looks at the top 4, takes instant or sorceries, put them at the bottom, and has flashback. Or you choose one, you put the rest at the bottom, and has flashback. I think that this card probably won't be very good. I was high on it in the set review, but kind of like I was just saying a minute ago, there aren't these incentives to put like 15 spells in your deck. I think there's incentives to put like 9 spells in your deck, 10, 11. But if you can't get to that 14, 15 mark, Arcane Infusion is just not very good. If you just run the numbers, you're pretty likely to miss on this card a good percentage of the time. Now, if you end up with the nutty deck, where you're like, I'm just all in spells, I have so many, I have the good rare payoffs, card's going to be very, very good. It's still a powerful card. Temper your expectations for the card, though, of course, and don't just put it in your 9 spell deck, because you're going to miss a lot of the time with it. Okay, that's all I want to say about blue-red. Moving on to blue-green flashback. We're rounding out the archetypes here. The uncommons here are Root Coil Creeper, blue-green for a 2/2. It taps to add 1 mana of any color, taps to add 2 mana of any color, spend that only to cast flashback spells. Oh, sorry. Spend it only to cast spells from your graveyard, so you can cast the service spells as well. And then it has an activated ability, blue-green tap, exile the creeper. You can return a card with flashback you own from exile to your hand. The other signpost is Winterthorn Blessing, blue-green for a sorcery. Put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature. Tap up to 1 target creature you don't control. The thing stays tapped and until the controller's next upkeep. Flashback 1 blue-green. So I think that the more I look at blue-green, the more it looks like a multicolor deck rather than a just base blue-green, maybe splashing a little bit deck. Obviously Root Coil Creeper hints at that by being a mana dork that adds a mana of any color. But I think that this is going to be the best home for just like taking some fixing and then taking the bomby cards that you get passed or you open. And maybe that's obvious, right? That's what blue-green wants to do a lot of the time. One of the interesting things about blue-green is that, or sorry, I should say one of the interesting things about flashback is that there aren't actually very many flashback cards in the set at common. There's like 3 or 4 green ones, and then like 1 or 2 blue ones. One of them's not very good. And then like 1 in every other color, I think. A lot of the flashback is concentrated in the multicolor slot. And you don't often want to be splashing the multicolored cards, even in your decks that are looking to splash, because a lot of them are more synergy cards rather than just generically good cards. There's a few of them that are generically good cards, right? But a lot of the flashback cards are just like, I synergize specifically with the cards in my color in my deck, right? And so I think you're mostly... I don't even know if I would categorize this deck as a flashback deck necessarily. I think it's just like a splish-splashy deck, where you have the tools to fix with Path of the Festival. It's 2 and a green for a sorcery, searches for a basic land, has flashback. And you've got like a few good flashback token makers, at 1 at uncommon, 1 at common. And I think, I don't know, this is another one that I'm like really trying to puzzle together exactly how it's going to work, and I have low confidence currently, because there's some fighting incentives in the sense that it's like, oh, you really want to play with flashback, but there's not really good flashback cards to play for the most part, and like there's some cards that really want you to have a high creature count, but then there's a lot of payoffs that want you to have a high spell count. Like I can see splashing some of the Spell Matters cards here, but then there's also cards that like really incentivize you that have flashback that want you to have a high creature count, which is, you know, again, kind of a fighting tension. I can see a deck where you have like Seize the Storm, which is the red token maker, giant make a trampoline token maker with flashback. Might be really, really good in a red-blue deck, right? In a red blue-green deck. I think the other thing blue-green could be doing is like weird loops. So we have like Turn the Earth, which is a single green mana instant. Choose up to 3 cards in the graveyards. The owners of those cards shuffle them into their libraries. You gain 2 life. Flashback, 1 in a green. I don't know the exact place for this card just yet, but like it reads to me as a card that, you know, Sam Black or Ethan or somebody will really crack as like, oh, you loop this and you like buy it back with this, and you know, you never deck. I mean, that's the baseline thing. You never deck with this card. Never, quote unquote. But your opponent will deck before you do most often. So I don't know. This blue-green is one that I'm excited to see how it pans out. There's a lot of fighting tensions, I think, with the payoffs and the incentives. Yeah, that's the most I can gather from the archetype without playing it just yet. I want to call out Black-White Sacrifice as a deck that I think is... a little bit of a sleeper. I think this deck, I have high hopes for it. So this is, you know, the Sacrifice Matters, cares about Sacrifice deck. Signpost Uncommon, Flush Taker, black and a white for a 2/2. Whenever you sack a creature, you scry 1, gain a life. Single colorless mana, sacrifice another creature, Flush Taker gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Really powerful card in vacuum, and I think there's just a lot of reasons to sacrifice things. Obviously, decay tokens play well here. Like I mentioned before, decay tokens play well with both sides of this card, where it's like, you know, you can just attack with your decay token, you get the gain 1, scry trigger if that's something that's beneficial for you. And then the other really powerful card here is Rite of Oblivion. So this is white-black for a sorcery. As an additional cost, cast a spell, sacrifice an online permanent, exile target online permanent, flashback for 2 white-black. Both of these Signpost Uncommons are just generically great cards, I think. Like some of the better ones we have in the set. And I think all of the the draw to this deck, or the reason I want to highlight it, is all of the mechanics in the set, or the majority of them, just play really well with what this deck wants to do. Disturb, obviously, is the baseline for, oh yeah, like obviously you see what's going on here. You can sack the front end, and you know, you get your creature back later, you sacrifice for value. You know, like I was saying before, you might want to bypass the battlefield with your Disturb creatures, but if you're not going to bypass the battlefield, maybe the next best thing to do is, you know, sacrifice the crappy side to an effect that generates some value. There's also in white some creatures that make tokens, right? Obviously, there's natural synergies there. And if you look at the black cards, there's Novice Occultist, which when it dies, you draw a card, you lose a life. There's Eaten Alive, single black mana sorcery. as an additional cost to cast it, you either sack a creature or pay 3 and a black, exile target creature or planeswalker. You just go through the set. There's a lot of cards in the set that just play really well in this archetype, and it's not like blue black or blue white where you're like kind of stretching to be like, oh, I see how I could like maybe play this like kind of below rate card to enable my synergy. I think all of the cards that enable the synergies in this deck are just good cards in the first place, right? So you combine good gold signposts and commons with the mechanics that play well with those uncommons being prevalent in the set, and the cards that you would naturally want to put in your deck just being good cards. I think you'll have a lot to look forward to with this deck. So this is a deck that I'm keeping my eye on, and going in, I think it's a deck I'm excited to draft. Closing out to the archetypes here, we've got red-white aggro. Not too much to say about this. Red-white has kind of a theme of flipping from day to night. I think, there's some cards that like reward you for when it flips from day to night or night to day. And I think that the joke here kind of is that, I was talking about that struggle between day and night. I think the joke here is that red-white aggro naturally is good at double spelling because you have cheap cards in your deck, so you can naturally flip it back to day on your turn a lot of the time. So like you're gonna like be playing this game where you're like, all right, your opponent passes and they go, it's nighttime, and you go, joke's on you, I cast 2 cheap spells and it's daytime. My take on this deck is I think that it's gonna play out like Strixhaven, red white dead, where it's like, sure, there's this like mechanical theme, but you're just better off attacking with cheap creatures, right? Sometimes the theme might come up once in a while where you're like, oh cool, like that triggered. I got a trigger here and there. But I think for the most part, it's just like, yeah, just beat down. Even like the rares in red-white point towards, yeah, just beat down. A lot of the commons point towards that as well. So I don't know. That's my expectation going in. And last, maybe least, is green-black morbid. There's not a ton of synergy here. Green-black ostensibly cares about your creatures dying. And, I mean, I don't think this deck looks, like, terrible or anything. But I just think it's going to be way more often than not a deck where you're like, okay, I'm green-black because I have good green cards and good black cards. Kind of how I played in AFR, actually, where you're like, maybe you open up a green bomb or something, or, and then you get past some good black removal, and you're like, all right, maybe I am just green-black, and I can make use of the morbid cards incidentally, right? The morbid cards do play well with some of the set mechanics, like the sacrifice things, like the decay zombies, I think. But I don't know if you really want to play into this theme all that much, because there's just like not that many payoffs. So I'm not sure. We'll see. I don't want to like call this bad or anything, but it doesn't excite me, basically. Okay, so big picture thoughts as we round out this episode here. It's one of the most common questions that I was asked, I've been asked in the past few days after the set review, also on stream, is where do you think this set lies on the rate versus synergy spectrum, right? Where in AFR, in Adventures of the Forgotten Realms, it was very rate heavy, where you didn't care too much about the synergies, and you just wanted to be like, this is a good card in a vacuum, let me put it in my deck, right? And like, I would argue actually by the end of the format, the synergies mattered a lot more than they did at the beginning, where people kind of figured out how to best use the synergies. Obviously Black-Red was a very synergistic deck, but I think even the other good decks like Black-White and Green-White ended up being synergy heavy. But, a lot of the baseline knowledge information going into AFR was like, just draft good cards. Basically, don't worry too much about enabling synergies. Although, I will say in defense of that, like, that mantra, a lot of the synergies ended up being traps, right? Like, blue-red ended up being kind of a trap, where it's just like, you just didn't want to draft that, and there's a few others in there as well. Venture to some extent, like blue-white Venture, right? The opposite end of this spectrum is a heavy synergy deck, or heavy synergy format, like Ikoria, where there are a lot of powerful cards in Ikoria, where you're just like, all of the commons in Ikoria, red is very powerful cards for the most part. But if your deck included cards that weren't doing the thing, they weren't cycling, they weren't doing the mutate thing, they weren't doing the black-red sacrifice thing, you were kind of sad. You were like, do I really have to put in this, like, you know, it might have been like a decent rate creature, but you're like, do I really have to play this? Like, this feels really bad, putting it in my deck that's, you know, ostensibly very high synergy. And, like, you just didn't care all that much about rate because synergies were so important. Where I think this set's gonna lie is probably somewhere in the middle, right? Where I think, you know, obviously rates, the baseline should be rates are important, right? And then anything on top of that, you know, past that, you're going to want to play like less than good cards on their surface when the synergies make up for that effect, where you're like not playing great cards, right? I think that the more narrow synergies, like flashback, like the spell stuff, they will be less common. But when you get a really good spells deck, like I was saying, or maybe a really, you know, splash heavy blue-green deck, maybe you're doing some weird loop-de-loop kind of things, right? You're going to care a lot about synergy. And I'm sure there's going to be decks in this format that are including, you know, 4 to 5 or 6 cards that are just like, well, that card's trash in a vacuum, but in my deck, it's specifically that it does this very cool thing, you know? So I would say the majority of the decks, you're going to care about rate. Even in something like, you know, werewolves, you don't really care about synergy that much there. Vampires, sure, there's like some synergies, but I was talking about the Coven stuff before where it's like, it'll just happen incidentally. And I think the long and short of it is that we're going to end up in a spot where a lot of the synergies are incidental just by drafting good cards, but then there will be a few subset of a small subset of decks where you are in this very heavy synergy space. So somewhere in the middle. That's my prediction. All right, rounding out the show here. Top comments. Just as a disclaimer here, these are not I don't have these in any particular order. I just want to note these as top comments in each color that I could see shooting to the very top of the top of the common pick orders, and just want to highlight cards that stand out to me, basically. So in white, we've got Gavany Silversmith. This is the Basri's Acolyte type card. It's 3 and a white, 4 mana for a 2/3. Enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. Card's really good, just powerful, aggressive card. Powerful card in general. Like, if this is just a 3/4 that puts a counter on your 3-drop, you're happy about that. Search Party Captain, 3 and a white for a 2/2. Spell costs 1 less for each creature you've attacked with this turn. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. So like the 4 mana mode of this card is not exciting, but passable. When you get to 3 mana, it's pretty good. If you can ever get this to 2, wow, you're in business. Like, that's really good. And if you ever like double spell with this, like imagine going like, attack the 3 creatures, play this, play another one. That's just like really, really, really good. So I think I would guess that Gavany Silversmith is better, but I could see this overtaking it. Homestead Courage is another one. This is the single white mana for a sorcery. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains vigilance until end of turn. Flashback, single white mana. Just a really good tool in an aggressive deck. I've seen some people, me and Ethan gave this a pretty high grade. We gave it like a B- or a C+ or something. I've seen some pushback against that. I would say a few things to that. I would say, one, this card is not going to be, a generically good card in the sense that like you're just going to put this in every single deck, but if your deck is an aggressive white deck, you're really going to want this card, because like, it just does a really good job of making 2 creatures attack when they couldn't otherwise, right? Where you go like, counter on my 3/3, counter on my 4/4, now you can't profitably block. That's really, really powerful. Of course, you're not going to put this in your like white controlling deck, but I don't think there's going to be that many in the first place. There was Travel Preparation from original Innistrad, which this card is kind of a callback to, and I don't think it's quite as good at that as that card, but I do have high hopes of this card being good. Gavany Trapper is another one. This is a single mana for an 0/2 tapper, 2 mana, tap target creature, and another card I've seen some pushback against, where I think that we've seen a lot of tappers in the past be not very good, but the ones that cost 2 mana. But the fact that this one is 1 to come down, 1 to cast the creature as opposed to 2 is a really big deal. Just like not needing to take time to cast this on 2, instead putting a creature on board that has actual power, that matters a lot, I would say. And then Lunarch Veteran. This is a card I'm actually pretty high on. I could see this being moving to the top of the pack here, actually. This is single white mana for a 1/1. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain a life. Disturb one in a white, and it has the backside is a 1/1 flyer. I think that this card plays really, really well with all of White's themes, right? It plays well with the Sacrifice theme. Obviously, Disturb. It plays well in Coven. It plays well in, what's that? Even like a red-white aggro deck doesn't mind this card, right? I think this card has a lot of small synergies, and for just like on rate, this card is just decent, right? This card is, it's like a Soul Sister on the front side and a cheap flyer on the back. So I'm really high on this card, and we'll see where it goes. All right, moving on to blue. Top comment, I think, is Organ Hoarder. I said it right this time, not Hoarding Ogre. This is 3 in a blue for a 3/2. It's a zombie, and it enters the battlefield. You look at the top 3, put one of them into your hand, and the rest into your graveyard. Just like really good card on rate. Does synergistic things. I like it a lot. Consider is a card I like quite a bit. Single blue mana instant. Look at the top card of your library. You may put this card into your graveyard. You draw a card. This card does similar to that white card, the Lunarch Veteran. It kind of just does a lot of stuff in all of the blue decks. Enables your spell stuff. Puts stuff in the graveyard for flashback and for Disturbed. And like it's kind of funny. The single blue mana cantrips have historically been like contested cards, I would say. Not contested. Contested is not the right word, but contentious cards among good limited players. Some limited players are like, yeah, you like cantrips are still really good in limited. The common use for cantrips is often constructed, but there's a large voice of people that will say, you still really want them in your limited decks. They add to your consistency. Then you have the camp that's like, well, they don't really do that much. You'd rather just put a real spell in your deck. So, depending on where you fall, you might value this card a little bit differently. But I just think this card does enough stuff, basically, and it's cheap enough, low opportunity cost enough. Has the potential to draw you like a card and a half, basically. So I really like it. Falcon Abomination. This is the 2 mana 2/2 flyer with make a 2/2 decay. Just a good card, I think. And Revenge of the Drowned. 3 in a blue for an instant. Put a creature on the top or the bottom of its owner's library. They get to choose, and you make it 2/2. So kind of a powerful card as well, in the sense of like if you have a use for the zombie token. It's just like a removal spell and it generates a resource. Kind of somebody made an analog to bake into a pie. I don't know. I wanted to go that far with this card, but it's kind of funny. Black's got a lot of stuff going on here. So the top 3 cards are the removal spells. I think where I'm not sure where these are gonna land. It's really interesting to kind of puzzle out which of these 3 are the what order they go in. 1, 2, 3. But we have Defenestrate, which is 2 in a black, instant, destroy target creature without flying, Eaten Alive, single black mana, sorcery. As an additional cost to cast a spell, sacrifice a creature or pay 3 in a black, exile target creature. And Olivia's Midnight Ambush, 1 in a black, instant, target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. If it's night, that creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. So, my gut says that Eaten Alive, the single black mana one, is the best one here. Because there's just like it's got a lot of stuff going for it, right? Like, obviously the joke is you sacrifice a decayed token, and there's a lot of those running around. I don't think it's wild to just have like 4 or 5 cards in your deck that make decayed tokens, making this like, one mana a lot of the time. Exile is really relevant here. So my money would be on this, but I don't, I'm not putting any, and I wouldn't bet a lot of money, basically. Like, if I had to, I'd bet on this one, but I wouldn't bet my life savings by any means, right? The other 2 I could see being, 1, 2, and 3, 3 and 2, who knows? Olivia's Midnight Ambush, which is the -2 one, is kind of interesting, because if the day-night cycle is already in play, you can just pass the turn to make it -13, -13. If you don't you want to cast a spell, you cast this on your opponent's turn as a -13, -13. Of course, the downside of that is that you're not always going to have the day-night cycle in play, so it might just be stuck as -2, -2 forever in your deck. Now, mind you, there are some black werewolves, and you can always pair this with red or greened out werewolves in your deck to get that day-night cycle going. And there's, white cards that get the day-night cycle going. So I don't actually think the day-night cycle not being in play is going to be that big of a deal here. As far as creatures go, the my top creatures are Ecstatic Awakener. It's the 1-mana 1/1 that sacrifices something, turns into a 4/4. I like Diagraph Horde. 4 and a black for a 3/4. Comes in, exiles 2 cards from a graveyard and makes 2 decayed zombies. The making zombies not being contingent on exiling stuff. There's that Moorcrut Banshee. There's the Moorcrut Behemoth, the 5-mana 7/6 menace guy that makes you sacrifice a creature if you want it to cost 5 and not 7. And there's Novice Occultist, which is 1 and a black 1/2. When it dies, you draw a card and you lose a life. So, I mean, I'm not sure. Like, these are all just earmarked as these all could be very good, but we'll have to see where they end up being. You know, I think if I had to put money on stuff, I really like putting money on things. Apparently, if I had to put money on the best of the bunch, I would actually put it on a Static Awakener here. Maybe Diagraph Horde. Red. Red is kind of straightforward. A lot of the good cards that are just removal spells. Moonrager Slash, the 3-mana deal 3. Immolation, 1-mana enchant creature. Enchant creature gets +2/-2. I don't actually mind the 5-mana removal spell here, which is Burn the Accursed. This is 4 and a red for an instant, deal 5 to target creature, deal 2 to that creature's controller, and if the creature would die, exile it. I think this card's actually just like fine. You know, better than Fireball. Maybe like approximately how good Fireball was in Adventures of the Forgotten Realms. You know, I don't think this is a card I will shy away from putting in my deck. The first copy of, basically. Where sometimes these 5-mana red removal spells tend to be not so great, you know. I think that Electric Revelation is an interesting one. So this is one that, so this is 2 in a red for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, discard a card, you draw 2 cards, and flashback 3 and a red. So the natural synergy of, like, you know, you having 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, who knows how many flashback or disturb cards in your deck with this card makes it better than your average Tormenting Voice effect, where you actually do kind of actually draw 2 cards on the front side a lot of the time, where you're like pitching a card to cast later and then drawing 2 new cards, and then the fact that it has flashback adds another layer onto it, or you just do that again at some point, or just do the, you know, filtering lands thing you can do with this kind of card. It's also just a card to pitch to other discard outlets, and then you can, like, have this in your grave for later. Because one of the nice things about this card is, like, it's not always a card you want to cast early, so you can feel comfortable pitching it early, and then you get the Tormenting Voice effect later, which is something you want later in the game, too. So, I don't know if this is going to be actually a top comment or anything, but I just want to note it as, like, I think it is better than your average Tormenting Voice effect, basically. And then Ardent Elementalist. This is 3 in a red for a 2/1. Enter the battlefield, return an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. I don't think this has to be a Spells Matter card. It's just a decent card. Buy back a removal spell. You know, buy back your good spells, whatever those happen to be. You know, I don't think this is going to be contingent on you having a lot of spells in your deck. You just want enough that you're going to have a target at some point in the game, basically. Moving on to green. Green doesn't excite me on its face value, but it often doesn't. It never does, I would say. Green cards tend to be a little bit more tame on first blush. So I have fewer cards I'm excited about in green, but we'll talk about them here. So I'm not sure which one of these I have as number 1, but the 2 in contention are Eccentric Farmer, which is 3 mana for a 2/3. ETBs, you mill 3 and you return a land from your graveyard to your hand. Shadow Beast Sighting, which is 2 and a green for a make a 4/4 token, flashback 7 mana. And then I have like a smattering of other creatures. Snarling Wolf, that's the 1 mana pump creature. Harvesttide Entry, 3 mana 3/1. 2 mana 3/1. If you have Coven, it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less this turn. Got the big 4/5 Vigilant Werewolf. I've got Duel for Dominance, which is a 2 mana fight spell, and if you have Coven, you put a counter on the creature that you're fighting with. Worth noting that something I didn't actually bring up in the set review with Ethan is that Prey Upon, which is the OG fight spell, which did debut in original Innistrad, that card actually was, part of why I think it took the limited community a while to kind of come around on fight spells in a vacuum aren't great, is that Prey Upon actually was very good in its original format. The creatures were just very big. The green creatures were just a lot bigger than the other creatures. Part of that is because, it was from 10 years ago, and, your black your black and your blue and your red creatures weren't as big as they were today. But part of it, of course, was that there's werewolves, right? So I would say that if you have werewolves in your deck, I'm a little more likely to include Duel for Dominance in my deck, both because it's an instant, playing well with werewolves, and you're going to have a large creature. Has all the caveats of be careful about when you fire it off, don't fire it off into open mana unless you need to. But I was initially very, very down on this card, and I think I'm a little bit higher on it, willing to admit that it might be one of the rare cases where fight spells, I'm happy to pick a fight spell relatively early. Let's finish it up from there. Chat, thank you so much for, being great guests here. I want to mention one more time, of course, if you like what we're doing here, check out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelup, so you can go there, support the show, support the podcast, support the stream, support everything there. And, chat Q&A. Send it to me, chat. Okay, so Fought Foo says, is Devious Cover-Up a real win condition like it was in Guilds of Ravnica? I think that the fact that we have werewolves fighting against counterspells makes me think no. That's not the only thing that makes me think no. I think Devious Cover-Up was more of a product of its format, where the Dimir decks just played this really good all instant speed game, almost win condition less control game sometimes, and Devious Cover-Up was a good way to win the game there. I think there's enough factors that point towards it not being, this format being a little bit hostile to that, where I'm not going to start at that card being as good as it was in that format, Just on top of the werewolves and the daybound, nightbound stuff fighting against counterspells, I think the fact that there's more good, aggressive, cheap threats than there was in Guilds of Ravnica also pushes towards that a little bit. So yeah, I'm just gonna start with no, but we'll see. I think from putting my designer's hat on for a second, I think that they were looking for a way in blue to get to put a shuffle effect back in, to put a shuffle effect in the set, and that's kind of a clever way to do so. Put it on Devious Cover-Up rather than put it on just a very clear, just very blunt, clear the mind style card, So I think they're just oh, cool, this kind of works. My read on that card being in this card file is they wanted a shuffle back effect in blue, and that's an interesting way to do that. How will the number of flashback disturb cards in your deck influence your land count? So I can definitely see decks where you want 18 lands as a baseline, because you have a lot of flashback, a lot of disturb, especially because some flashback costs are a little more expensive. So I would say in your average deck, where you're just a green-white deck, a red-black deck, maybe just a mid-range deck with some flashback spells, I think you're probably going to still, keep it to 17. I don't think you want to necessarily add an additional land. I don't think there's going to be a baseline 18-land format. But yeah, be on the lookout for your blue decks with a lot of places to put your mana where you just want that 18th land. Especially if you're blue-green splashing, mana requirements might be a little tough, so you might want that additional land. I've been thinking about day and night, and it seems as if night is the inevitable endgame. How much do you think this is the case, and how often do you think the state will flip in an average game? So I think day to night and night to day is gonna I don't know if I can put a number on it, but I think it's gonna happen. Once the day-night cycle is introduced to the game, I would say it's gonna go back and forth a few times. Is day-night an inevitable endgame? I don't think so necessarily, because there's enough mechanics in the set. So if you put day and night into AFR, I would say yes, because for the most part, people ran out of spells in AFR. There weren't mechanics that gave you, there was no learn lesson. There was nothing that made additional spells just conjured into the game, right? Where people in AFR generally ran out of spells at a certain point, and you were top decking, right? I think because of flashback and a few clues, there's a little bit of investigating in the set, not much, but there's enough ways to cast additional spells where you're approaching the point where you're kind of in that cheeky, you never run out of things to do area. that people like to talk about, where I don't think it's going to be like, oh man, I'm just top decking it, it's just night forever now. I think you're going to have enough places to spend your mana. So I think in your average game, it's not going to be like, well, now we're at the night stage of the game. You're still going to have some play where you can flip it back and forth. How often do you think you'll be splashing or going 3 colors in this set? I would say not often. Like, there's not a ton of tools for splashing outside of like the blue green, which does want to splash. I imagine black green might splash a little bit too, just being like a grindy green deck. So I don't think that much. Like, I think your baseline should be your 2 colors the majority of the time, and then in dedicated, like, I'm a deck that wants to splash, I'm going to be splashing. There's not a mechanic like Learn Lesson with Environmental Sciences or with Venture with Treasures. There's not like this mechanic that naturally puts easy mana fixing into your deck like we've seen in the past few sets. So I think, a splash in like your red-black deck won't be that common, basically. You'll have to work for it if you really want to splash. There's Evolving Wilds, for sure. But another thing to consider is a lot of the gold cards, the uncommon ones, don't play particularly well outside of their given deck. So you're going to be splashing like maybe removal in some decks potentially, but I don't love that as a concept in general, and then maybe some single pip bomb rares. Fafu says, do you think the importance of having a turn 2 play is slightly overstated since there are only two 2-drop werewolves that come uncommon and above? Yeah, I think a little bit. Yeah, me and Ethan were talking about that as like a point for the format, like a real something you really have to be concerned about. But I think, like you said, there's only 2 uncommon werewolves. I would say, though, I still think just, because of how modern limited is, you just want 2-drops. Like, I don't think we're going to ever go back to a world where it's like, nope, you can just ignore your 2-drop slot. And the 2-drops in the set are pretty good for the most part. So I don't think you're going to need to run like 10 2-drops or whatever, but you got to fill out your your 6 2-drops to be comfortable just like keeping pace with any deck, really. All right, thank you, everybody. This was a longer episode than I expected it to be, but really appreciate everybody hanging around for this episode. I'm really excited, of course, for Thursday when the set actually comes out, and we'll see how the podcast goes, because I'm going to be on Lords Unlimited on the Monday episode, and usually I do the State of the Format episode around there. So I'm not sure if I'm going to do something in addition, or I'm just going to port the State of the Format episode over to, basically being on Lords Unlimited. We'll see, though. We'll see. As always, this is going to go up on the YouTube and on the VODs on Twitch if you want to see the video, if you're a listener on audio. And we'll see you next time on the next episode of Limited Level Ups. See you, everybody.